Hi everyone, I'm Mia.
Hi, I'm Kate.
Welcome to the next panel of the day, Environmental Justice, Building Community Power to Fight Corporate Interests and Environmental Racism. We are thrilled to introduce a group of brilliant and deeply experienced leaders in the movement in Philadelphia and beyond. Before we do, we want to let everyone know that after our panelist discussion, we will be open for questions, so students will be circulating with note cards where you can write those down. Finally, in order to allow those who couldn't join us in person to enjoy the conversation, and also for CLE, this event is recorded and live streamed. If you have any questions about that, feel free to ask Kanisha or anyone in the TPIC staff.
So I have the honor of first introducing Felicia Teeter, who is a Black and Yakama trans non-binary queer state and police abolitionist. A graduate of Dartmouth College, they are a diversity and equity consultant with Deep Blue Women Consulting Company, providing organizations with anti-oppression consulting and training. Their community organizing focuses on Black and Native liberation, self-determination and sovereignty via direct action, transformative justice, and mutual and community building. They have organized with multiple groups on independent, frontline, Indigenous-led fights for sovereignty and environmental protection.
And Dr. Nicky Sheats is the director of Thomas Edison State University's Center for the Urban Environment. He guides its work to advance environmental justice goals at the local and national levels. The center's current work focuses on air pollution, climate change, energy policy, cumulative impacts, developing environmental justice legal strategies, and increasing the working capacity of environmental justice communities. Sheats was a founding member of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, and he also served on the New Jersey Clean Air Act Council, the EPA Clean Air Act Advisory Committee, and the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Sheats was also a co-author of the Human Health chapter of the 2014 National Climate Assessment. So thank you for being here, Dr. Nicky Sheats. And next we have Nicolas O'Rourke. A West Philadelphian, Reverend Nicolas O'Rourke has taken on multiple roles, from pastor to community organizer to city council candidate to advocate against systemic racism and Islamophobia. He is now the director of organizing for the Pennsylvania Working Families Party, where he continues to lead advocacy for the Green New Deal policies that will focus on investment in Black, brown, and poor communities most harmed by government-sanctioned environmental hazards.
Jerome Shabazz grew up in North Philadelphia and is dedicated to ensuring that Philadelphians and all people can enjoy environmental freedom to safely breathe, move, and live in their communities. As the executive director of the Overbrook Environmental Education Center, he oversees educational programs and community services that lead the way for the environmental justice movement in Philadelphia and nationally. He is also an active member in state and national environmental justice councils. He is a member of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the Environmental Justice Board, the Citizen Advisory Council, and is an active member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Councils.
Finally, we would like to introduce and turn things over to our moderator, Kate DeVasto. Kate is a second-year law student and a SPARE organizer. So with that, we'll turn things over to Kate.
Hi. The all-important clicker. Well, thank you so much, Kate and Mia. It's really an honor to be here with all of these incredible panelists today. And so one of the most critical parts of our discussion today is the use and control of land. And so in order to fully understand the environmental justice struggle, we need to understand what land are we talking about when we're talking about Philadelphia. So my first question is to you, Felicia. If you can tell us, whose land is this?
So we're currently in Lenape, Hoking. It encompasses parts of, there should be a slide. No map. It encompasses parts of New Jersey, New York, including New York City, Eastern Pennsylvania, maybe we'll get it up, Northern Delaware, and Western Connecticut. The Lenape diaspora is made up of 2 state-recognized tribes, 3 federally recognized tribes, and 2 First Nations in so-called Canada. In New Jersey, you have the Nanticoke Lenape and the Ramapo Lenape. In Oklahoma, you have the Delaware Nation and the Delaware Tribe of Indians. Wisconsin, you have the Stockbridge Munsee community. And in Ontario, you have the Munsee Delaware Nation. and the Moravian of the Thames First Nations. It's important to contextualize not just whose land we're on, but where people are now. There are currently Lenapes who are living in Philadelphia and are living in Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania does not have any state or federally recognized tribes. It's also important to take Indigenous folks out of like history and out of the like 1800s, because it's not that this used to be someone's land and now it's occupied and settled. It's that Indigenous folks are still here. Lenape are still here. Lenape folks are still wanting to come back to their homelands, even though they have had genocide committed against them and been forcibly removed. And our job, even myself as a native person but not a Lenape, I'm Yakima from the West Coast, but our job as people in Lenape community and in Lenape homeland is to not only understand whose land we're on, but also work with the people whose land we're on. So you can Google any of these tribes. I would say that you should Google all of them, and you can find contact information for them. You can write them letters. You can say, hey, how do we better do our job in Lenapehoking to honor you and to honor what you want and you need to be able to have your rights honored here. So I would encourage everybody to do that. Also, there is a link to nativeland.ca. You can use that wherever you are from to find out whose land you're on, and I believe that also has links within it so that you can find those tribal communities, and you can begin talking to them and building within your own communities in solidarity and collaboration with Native folks.
Thank you so much, Felicia, and please do follow what she has suggested to all of you. It is our duty, being here now occupying this land, to follow up, as she has said, and to realize what our role is here today. Next, we want to get a sense of what we all mean when we talk about environmental justice. So I'll start first with Jerome and then Nicolas. If you can give us a sense of what does environmental justice mean to you in Philadelphia?
Well, thank you very much, Kate. The whole idea of environmental justice, for me, tends to, you can tend to appreciate it more greatly when you think about the environmental injustice. And the environmental injustices that we see in communities is where a disproportionate burden of the environmental impacts are placed upon communities and people who did not have a say, institutionally are not connected to, and are not actively engaged with the process of that environmental impact. And so it's an intersecting concept of how community, health, and environment interacts with itself. And the idea of environmental justice is to evenly or more equitably disperse those burdens upon people so that no one particular group of people are disproportionately burdened.
Not too different from what Brother Jerome has lifted up. I do think it's important to note that we see the impact of climate, particularly on, or climate change, particularly on communities of color. One of the things that we lifted up quite a bit during the campaign with Kendra Brooks, who was on the panel, I think, earlier, was how this negligence by many to pay attention to climate change and do something about it is often having impact on poor black communities, places like Philadelphia, which do not have the kind of greenery in their communities that may be found in more affluent neighborhoods, thereby raising the temperature in those areas where we're mostly surrounded by asphalt and concrete, it's going to get hotter in those communities. And so oftentimes they'll feel the brunt of the climate change much earlier than more well-to-do parts of the community. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about racial justice and environmental justice and the intersection thereof.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And so now to Nicky and Felicia, both of your work focuses on environmental justice beyond just Philadelphia. Can you help us to understand what the National Environmental Justice Movement stands for and how you think these issues go beyond just the single city context? And if we could start first with you, Nicky.
Okay, can you pull up me there you go. So I'm a nervous speaker. I like to stand up. First thing I always do is I button my coat because it makes me seem more credible, I think. Okay, so here's a slide that I've shown all over the country. I come from Trenton, New Jersey, right up the road. I think it's all over the country. I've shown it so much that my EJ colleagues tease me about it, but I don't care. I have a new audience to show it to, so that's okay. I'm in hog heaven. And the slide goes to the heart of environmental justice, I think. It shows a relationship between race, income, and pollution. And folks in the panel have already talked about this. Here you can kind of see it graphically. So let me take 5 minutes and go through the figure. I think it does go to the heart of environmental justice. I think it explains why I've become involved with the environmental justice movement and why people in the movement are concerned and have also joined the movement. So first of all, let me say the slide was developed by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, not by us crazy EJ folk in New Jersey. They produced it in 2009. And the first thing they did was they estimated the amount of cumulative impacts in every neighborhood in New Jersey. And you can think of cumulative impacts informally as a very, very rough estimate of the total amount of pollution in the neighborhood. You can ask me later for a more formal definition. So they estimated the amount of cumulative impacts in every neighborhood in New Jersey, and then they said, well, what's the relationship between race and income? So they graphed it, and you see it here. So look at the top figure. Top figure talks about the number of people of color living in a neighborhood. So as the number of people of color living in the neighborhood increases, what happens to the estimated amount of pollution? It increases, right? And the same thing for the number of people living in poverty. As the number of people living in New Jersey neighborhoods in poverty increases, the amount of pollution in the neighborhood increases. It's almost a straight line relationship, isn't it? You know, if you moved a few of the graphs there. So I'll say what I've always said all over the country. What this is presenting evidence of is that if you live in New Jersey, the amount of pollution in your neighborhood is connected to, as we've said already, race and income. Right? The amount of money in your pocket and the color of your skin. And this goes against everything that we claim we stand for in New Jersey and in the country, and I imagine in Pennsylvania also. And, you know, I've said this so many times, but even now, as I said, I start to get angry again, you know, just thinking of that concept. And, of course, it's not only New Jersey. I mean, relationships like this were found on the national level in several national reports that were produced in the late 1980s, and that actually helped to start the EJ movement. Now, one reason why I like to show the graphs is that you can point to stuff. So you can see the environmental justice neighborhoods, communities of color, low-income neighborhoods. They're to the right? They're to the right of the graph. And just so you know, Newark, the largest city in New Jersey, which is about 88% black or black Latino, is what? Is right over here. Right? So you can see the communities to the right have a disproportionate, what Jerome and Nicolas were talking about, disproportionate amount of pollution. So what we've come to say is that we need multiple policies. We need to develop policies. We need to develop policies that are going to reduce that disproportionate amount of pollution that you see represented up there. And we think there's going to be multiple policies. We've come to say that we're going to need cumulative policies for cumulative impacts. And, you know, there's going to be, some of the policies are going to directly address the cumulative impacts issue. I mean, it'll have cumulative impacts in the title, and we have those policies. They haven't been implemented, but they've been passed up. We've kind of passed them up from the New Jersey level to the national level, and there are actually a couple of bills about those policies now. But other policies will address, you know, different parts of the disproportionate pollution. And one of the things, as Nicolas was talking about climate change, we've brought to the fore is that we think the climate change mitigation policy needs to be used to address the disproportionate amount of pollution. And I want to flag that because it's been a controversial issue for us, because the type of policy that's being used now to address climate change, carbon trading, the environmental justice community is taking strong stances against, because it doesn't guarantee emissions reductions in EJ communities. They may or may not happen, and you can ask more about that later. But that's been a flashpoint of division between the environmental groups, policymakers, and environmental justice movement. So I'm going to stop there and just say, and say we need to develop the policies We need to develop the policies and implement them so we can uncouple this, what I often call unholy relationship between pollution, income, and race.
Thank you. And so I want to now bring it back over to Felicia.
Thank you for that. Super informative. I love graphs.
Kind of wacky, but.
When writing this policy, we need to make sure that we are also centering Indigenous and Black communities. It's not pointless, but it's problematic to create huge wind turbines on sacred land and to destroy ceremonial spaces for Indigenous folks. It's problematic to create solar farms that then disrupt the migration of animals and food sources for Indigenous people that is then destroying their culture and their way of life. So environmental justice, while there are green energy solutions available, we also need to make sure that those green energy solutions are also respective of Indigenous communities and their ability to preserve their cultures and their life ways. Environmental justice is really simple. It means ensuring that the planet and people have the means necessary to survive and to thrive. To get to environmental justice, we need to dismantle the barriers that are stopping these things from happening. Capitalism, corporate control, colonization and imperialism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, Indigenous erasure. We can't continue to have these things within an environmental justice movement and still call it justice. For Indigenous folks specifically, environmental justice is important because the environment is not just where we live, it's not just our ability to breathe or eat or go to school without asbestos in our schools, or to be able to drink the drinking water that comes out of our tap. Those are all really important. But also when we lose our connection to environment, Indigenous folks also lose connection to ourselves. We lose connection to our culture. We lose connection to our stories. We lose connection to our language. Because all of those things are part of living within our environment, living within our homeland. That's also why forced removal of Indigenous communities, such as the Lenape here, are so destructive. Because you can no longer, how do you tell a story about your cosmology and about where you're from if you can't point to those places on a map? If the mountain that you talk about has been destroyed, how do you talk about the spirit that lives there? How do you talk about the land or your relationship to it if you no longer have it to go to as a reference or a guide? That also destroys our ability to heal. Environmental justice is not just about being able to breathe, but it's also about being able to heal ourselves, being able to access our medicines, being able to access our spiritual places, being able to share those things with next generations, being able to help other people understand our own worldviews because we can show it to people. So for Indigenous folks, environmental justice is a really large thing because it's literally, and for everyone, it's literally how do you live in the world? How do you sustain yourself in a way that doesn't hurt others, in ways that allows others to sustain themselves as well?
Thank you. And I think we're all picking up on very powerful points of what is essential and to the core of environmental justice, different from the mainstream environmental movement. So my next question, kind of to the full panel, is what do you think is really missing in the environmental mainstream movement that environmental justice movement is trying to bring?
Can I get my slide?
Oh, yeah.
One of the important parts of my work is to deconstruct these important impacts on human health and our relationship to the environment to a community who have other priorities. When you think about Philadelphia, we look at data all the time about poverty rates. We have areas in the city where you have 26, 27% rates of poverty, if not higher. It creates a sort of disconnect when we're talking about environmental impacts on their lives because they're worrying about food, they're worrying about shelter, people are worrying about their children. They're not thinking about the environmental impact. So what we found in our work in the Overbrook Environmental Education Center is that it's easier to demonstrate the value than to describe the value. We use terms all the time amongst ourselves about accumulative impacts and parts per million of of chemicals in water and lead and all kinds of domestic toxins. That is something that policymakers and arguably most of you are lawyers, I think, in law school or practicing law, understanding the need to create policies that will help people who may not even understand what those policies represent. To be able to put in place mechanisms to deconstruct what those complicated factors are, because ultimately it will impact your health. It will impact your quality of life. Let me give you an example of some of the things that we talk about with our community. First of all, we look at this idea of environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, and income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. And this is something that is in Pennsylvania is an actual right? I think Article 1, Section 27 in our Constitution here in Pennsylvania, we're one of the few states that actually mandates that the citizens have a right to clean air and water and land. But this is really what it's all about. When you see this level of contamination and the right for people just to dump trash and debris, we've done brownfield studies on these particular sites that we're getting ready to show you, and we have these high levels of arsenic, high levels of lead, petroleum, all kinds of chemicals coming out of cars. And the amazing thing is that this site that we just showed you pictures of is right a buttressing against neighbors and homes, people who are not even aware that there was zoning that allowed that kind of activity to take place right behind them. And so the idea of being able to demonstrate what it represents is equally as important to policies that drive this kind of unhealthy use of land and water around people. We know in Philadelphia that the same way Nicky was able to show us charts around poverty, environmental impacts, and neighborhood, we can, by zip code, determine where a lot of disparities are going to be in Philadelphia, by zip code. I think if you look at the Philadelphia's Department of Health's 2017 report, was interesting. We helped to inform, the EJ folks helped to inform the planning to allow the economic data to correlate with the neighborhood and the environmental disparity. So you can see in the snapshot, the poorer communities are the communities that have the greater impacts. And this tension that we have when we talk about environmental justice, there's a slight tension, particularly in an area like Philadelphia, because you have this old infrastructure, houses that are decomposing. We have a lot of materials that were used in the 50s that are illegal today, but they're still embodied within this architecture. And as it's decomposing, it's affecting health. You know, one of the bigger issues, we keep talking about lead, because lead is in 87% of all Philadelphia properties, and primarily in properties built before 1978. The older the city, the older the real estate. And this is a big issue. Unsuspecting families who are doing simple repairs in their homes are exposing their children to lead. So our goal is to demonstrate what that looks like, and to sort of exploit the opportunities in it. The opportunities is that it creates a whole new economy, if you will, of people working on the correction of these environmental disparities. We have groups of folks who are looking at the juxtaposition of old infrastructure and new, but showing what you can do with it to remove some of those hazards. We do that by identifying the careers that take place that improve those conditions. So where we're working in West Philadelphia in particular, we're doing stormwater management training, we're doing lead awareness training, we're showing folks how to deal with soil, how to manage soil, how to have healthy relationships with soil. The goal is to get people to see as a new normal the responsibility to go along with the disposal of waste and identifying its impacts on people, and to have at a community and neighborhood level a conversation around what those impacts look like at a neighborhood level. And so our goal is to raise the specter of the conversation, make it the new normal, bring people into the discussion who ordinarily have other issues, as we talked about before, and to make it a more inclusive process so that we can address some of these ongoing problems in communities.
Yeah, I think just kind of in the same vein of what Jerome is talking about, one of the things that we've come to realize is that there are a lot of us who are talking about the technical issues as it relates to environmental justice and the impact of climate change and the carbon footprint and things like that, which are absolutely essential. I think most of us are aware that we have about 10 years, right, before we start really seeing the effects of this negligence, and we'll start seeing what blossoms from that. Expecting great migrations coming up because certain parts of the earth will be uninhabitable, and then we'll see rises of new fascism where people of color trying to come to the states. Well, therefore, folks who have typically denied climate change will now start embracing it and suggesting that because they're coming, we can't allow them to come to the U.S. And so this is a major piece that we have to really get on board with, this great turning from fossil fuel economy and moving into a green, renewable economy. And so it's absolutely essential. So for us, it's about bringing a racial and economic inequality lens to all the climate issues, and being mindful about the questions that we're asking as we're moving out of the fossil fuel economy into this green, renewable energy economy. Who is at the table making decisions about this new infrastructure that we're about to build? Where are the impacts going to be felt, as was already lifted up, right? Who's going to get the training and the jobs for the infrastructure that's being built? Who will own the energy infrastructure? Will it be shared by the people, or will it continue to be, this extractive practice that we have seen forever, that bolsters and enriches the 1% and suppresses the 99 off of our energy needs, right? These are the kind of questions that we have to be proactive in asking, because we know that we have to move away from how we've been doing things. And so we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the centrality of identity, race, and class in the middle of that as we're putting this new thing together. I think there are a couple of hot button points that came up, at least in the last year or so, that really kind of drew me in on this. I'm newer to the conversation. I was shocked into the conversation around environmental justice due to the PES refinery explosion. You hear things about environmental justice and climate change. It's another thing for there to be almost a nuclear explosion happening in your backyard. And so we began to ask questions about, what happens at this point. I think in December, we were talking about how last month there were going to be 15 corporations that were bidding on the land. Right. This is who is looking at this land. There's this war, this tug of war going on over land use and energy right now, and we have to be mindful about who is prioritizing this land. So my sister here, this person here, was lifting up the importance of us being mindful about whose land this is and how it's going to be occupied going forward. And if corporations who are hell bent on constant wealth extraction are the only ones bidding over it, and we're not in that conversation, we're going to end up losing out. It's important to prioritize the people that were living in that area, right? That there are families with babies that were living blocks away from this major explosion that are harmed, something we have to pay attention to. And also, right, as that refinery shut down, there were some 1,000 jobs, good jobs, to the tune of $100,000 a year in some cases, that were lost immediately, right? And so you have to feel for folks who were working in this old way of doing energy, and where do you go from there, right? Another point I think that it's important to lift up is how we see the continual redlining that comes out of this fossil fuel economy, where the septic gas plant is being pushed forward in Nicetown, another historically black community. Poor, low income, where you are constantly seeing that these places where you find black and brown folk, queer folk, low income folk, are oftentimes the places that are perceived as the waste spaces. And how do we make sure that we are kind of shifting away from that? So I believe that the conversation around the restructuring of this new infrastructure and who is owning that and how it's impacting our communities is absolutely essential.
And as stated before, as we are creating this green economy, we need to center those who have been doing this work for hundreds of years. Since time immemorial, Indigenous folks have been caretakers of the land, and they have been ensuring that things stay in balance. And as we're doing this, as we are creating new solutions, we need to make sure that Indigenous folks have a seat at the table. We also need to understand and make our movement more accessible so that people understand that environmental justice, so that we understand that environmental justice taps into every single part of people's lives. When people are hungry, that's an environmental justice issue. When you can't grow food in your backyard, that's an environmental justice issue. When you can't go to a school without breathing in asbestos, when you can't drink your own water at school, and you have to wait until you go home to hope that you have a filter on your tap, but you probably don't until you're still drinking like low levels of lead or high levels of lead, that's an environmental justice issue. The problem is not that people don't know they're impacted by environmental justice. The problem is that we are talking about environmental justice as an up here issue, as numbers, as facts, as 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we need to be talking about and understanding environmental justice as things that affect people's everyday lives. When you can't go outside of your home without having to worry about your asthma being triggered. I just had a friend who hasn't had asthma complications for the last 10 years after the refinery, has now had multiple asthma attacks and had to be hospitalized. Like, that is an environmental justice issue. Those people need to be at the table, need to be leading the solutions, not just sitting and listening while other people dictate the solutions to them. When we are creating these solutions, we also need to focus on Indigenous folks and Black and Native and Poor folks, not just having their consultation, not just saying, oh, we asked them this thing, but also making sure that we're having their consent. They are consenting to the green energy solutions that are being put forth, that they are a part of that, and they are a part of the decision-making process. We also need systems change. I think we often, largely based on capitalism, we want to make environmental justice about your individual change. You got a metal straw. You reuse the same water bottle. You have a bag that you take to the grocery store with you. All of that's great, but that's not going to stop Coca-Cola from being the largest polluter of plastics in the world. I don't control that. So we also have to look at larger systems of change and advocate for those, not just advocate for small incremental changes, but actual changes to the way that people are living with the planet and living with each other, so that we can recreate things that aren't just sustainable in the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but are actually going to repair and change the world that we live in overall. Same with things like recycling and renewable energy. It's pointless, again, maybe not pointless, but very problematic for us to be doing tons of recycling in Philadelphia if A, most of that recycling goes to the landfill, so you're actually not recycling anything, and B, if all of your recycling ends up on the beaches of the global south. What is the point of that? What is the point of saying that we have all of these great technologies if to create these technologies we are still mining? We are still putting people's lives at risk. We are still extracting minerals from the earth. That is not green energy. That's a different form of green capitalism. So we need to make sure that when we are creating these solutions to the climate crisis that we have created, we need to make sure that we are not simply replicating or putting a pretty bow on capitalist and corporate control of energy, but we are actually looking at how do we use less energy, how do we work in a more balanced way with the planet, with the earth, and make sure that is our focus as we work.
I kind of smiled the part when Felicia was talking because, I get asked a question often, well, if you come and speak, tell me something practical that you can do, like, change the light bulb. And I'll say, well, you got to fight racism. Yeah, it's a systemic, you got to fight classism. It's how do you, yes. So let me go back to your original question when you said, what is the mainstream environmental movement missing? Well, we're look, on a very just, literal level, they're missing people of color a lot of times. If you do the climate change policy and Felicia's at the table, it's going to be very different than if she's not at the table, right? How you do it. And I think, look at it this way. The other thing that's, I won't say it's missing, it's just different. The environmental movement focuses on, or primarily focuses on, saving the earth. Now, they're concerned about communities, but right, the primary focus is on the environment. The environmental justice movement, my primary focus is on saving communities, not actually on saving the earth. Now, I care about the earth, but I'm primarily focused on saving communities. So that will drive you to different practice and different policy points, because fundamentally we're looking at different things. So like with the climate change issue, the focus on climate change mitigation policy from the mainstream point of view is reducing carbon dioxide emissions. That's what causes climate change. From the EJ point of view, reducing the local emissions that includes carbon dioxide, but includes all these other things that are causing asthma, is just as important as reducing carbon dioxide, right? So the national climate change policy we developed from EJ comes from the local concern about air pollution that's killing people and making people sick in those local communities today. And so we take the stance that if the climate change mitigation policy doesn't also reduce those local pollutants in EJ communities, as well as carbon dioxide, it's not good enough. So we bring that concern for communities into the overall policy. Right? And we ask the question, okay, you're going to save the world from climate change. Who are you saving the world for? Right? Because if the folks in our community die from asthma, that child's going to be just as dead. As, even if you save the world, the folks in our community are still going to be just as dead as if you didn't save the world. And that can be a hard concept when you tell people, look, I'm down for saving the world, but if our communities aren't saved with it, that's an issue. Right? We got to do both. Doing one is not good enough. So you can see where the clash can come, where the clash can come in.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of add to the point that if we really look at this whole movement around the environment and regulations and policy, it's an industry-centric proposition. An environmental justice movement is a people-centric proposition. And the people-centric proposition is looking at the effect of the environment on human life. And the important part of making that distinction is that the drivers for our policy, the drivers for our economies, are really looking at the permissible limits and the controls around industry. And even though you have a permissible limit for exposures that industry produces, it might be acceptable by law, but that's only one industry. If you look at an area like Chester, PA, it has probably per square acre more industrial polluters than any other county in Pennsylvania. Yet, all of the industries are operating within their permissible limits. No one's taking into consideration the multitude of all of those accumulative impacts on the life of those people. So just by looking at the effects of people from a people perspective, it changes your insight on what's actually happening versus what's legal, what's permissible, what's acceptable. And the environmental justice movement has to be that movement that put people first. No one's trying to take industry out of business, but we're trying to take anything out of business that's has a derogatory effect on the human condition.
Thank you all. I hope that everyone continues to see just how much there is an issue when we try to do environmentalist work without focusing on capitalism, focusing on racism, focusing on essentially ways that we seek to exclude each other. If you want more statistics to back up everything that's been said on this panel, look to Green 2.0. Just looking at one stat, in 2019, people of color only made up 22% of those in top power positions, okay? As you can see here, look at all the voices that are being lost when you try to lead a movement without people of color, people from the communities most impacted by environmental harms, leading that charge. And that's also where all the money tends to go, right, to those type of mainstream foundations. And people that we see here are not getting those same fundings. So moving on kind of to the next question, wanting to highlight and offer it to the full panel to describe more of the work that you're doing right now in environmental justice.
So our work has always been for the full life of the community. So we work with children, we work with young teenagers, we work with adults, because oftentimes when you create the culture of change, you have to deal with the entire family. We have children, so what was interesting for us is that we started out our work looking purely at the environmental impacts of a neighborhood. Deliberately and very intentionally found a site that we knew had environmental conditions that was unaware to the neighbors who lived around it. And then went through this public process of engaging community people to get them more interested, aware, and engaged in the process of what the cleanup looked like. And what that enabled us to do is introduce environmental literacy language, to introduce who the responsible parties were, to introduce to folks who weren't scientists, who weren't environmentalists, to the concept that there's a cause and effect to industry, that you shouldn't just be excited by some industry saying we're going to produce 5 jobs, but then they produce some byproduct that will contaminate your neighborhood for the next 20, 30, 40, 100 years. And to get people interested in their own wellness. And that's a big part of what I'm interested in, is to help deconstruct these problems so that citizens can advocate along with demanding their policymakers and political people do a better job, but they themselves can do a better job at understanding where the consequences of poor disposal, our issues with litter, our issues with stormwater. You know, we have problems that in poor and African American Latina communities that are driven directly due to poverty. If you have someone going into your home, you don't have money to repair your home with a contractor who knows how to do proper containment, they may rip open the walls and expose your entire family to asbestos, to lead, to other chemicals, to mold. That is a direct daily impact on your family's health and life. And so when you go ask the question, what are we doing on a day-to-day basis, it's just making people aware of that. Making people aware of the things that you can do to check to see whether or not your service lines are lead service lines, whether there's lead in the water fixtures of your home, whether there's lead in the solder that's used in your home that can contaminate your water sources. Helping people understand that you're more likely to be impacted by lead by way of paint and soil. And help people understand that there are places where you can get your soil tested. We have neighborhoods that we've tested in University City, and this area too, I won't scare you, but there are parks in this area where we have these thresholds of 400 parts per million of lead in soil, 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 parts per million of lead, children playing in it. So educated people who are not aware that when we're doing all this construction in these neighborhoods, the contractors, if they don't have policies that will require them to contain their work, they typically open the windows up and just blow it out, and all of that dust migrates around your neighborhood. And the reason why we're talking about lead hundreds, thousands of years later is because it does what it does well. It binds. And once it binds, it's very, very difficult to remove it unless it's very intentional for you to remove it. So there are areas where in Frankfurt, where we have old smelting plants, they still have contaminants that were a result of the byproduct of those smelting plants from 120 years ago. So the issue of time mitigating the concern is foolish today, as it was when people said the solution to pollution was dilution and kept throwing pollution in the Delaware River, thinking that because I'm putting this small body of pollution into this bigger body of water, that it will dilute it to the point where it was safe for human exposure, and it's not. What we're dealing with now is a change in culture where 30 years ago, our biggest issues with contaminants was industry. And we regulated industry through permits. So if you had some manufacturing process and you were emitting contaminants into the air, whatever municipality or state you were in would regulate by way of the EPA how much exposure of that chemical you could put into the air, how much of that chemical you can dump into the water, how much of that chemical you can put into land. However, now we have, that was a point source pollution where we knew exactly where it was coming from, and if that person was in violation, they would go through some kind of violation and get fined, and people would address that issue specifically. But now we have this sort of non-source point pollution where it's happening in these incongruent spaces where you decide that after watching a TV show 3 o'clock in the morning that this wonderful product can clean your brass. You buy the brass clean it chemical. And then when you get it, you find out it doesn't work. What do you do with it? So part of our question is, if you multiply that behavior by the multitudes, that becomes a new sector of pollution in of itself. And so our goal is to address these issues from policy, law, procedure, zoning, but also address the issue from community, helping people understand practices that are safer, understand practices that will not do greater harm. How do you dispose of your medicines? How do you dispose of your, if you take a quart of motor oil, there's communities that like to change their own motor oil because they don't have a lot of money to go to a mechanic. A quart of motor oil can contaminate 10,000 gallons of potable water. It's the water that we all drink. It's only reprocessed over and over again. But it brings a question to how much of that can we deal with. You know, we have these bigger issues, and they're huge issues when we talk about energy processing, when we talk about Philadelphia Gas Works, when we talk about those energy producers, and they're not simple questions. Why? If PGW, for example, has 500,000 customers, and 40% of that customer base can't pay for its energy, you know, what do you do with those 200,000 people? That's a big question. How do we allow them to keep their dignity? And there are technologies that can probably address some of those issues, and that's part of the concern is how do we integrate that in to our specter of thinking. And the big point for me in this work is beginning at our beginning. Start at our beginning. Don't wait until the conditions have exacerbated to the point of an emergency before we start to work on it. We look at this concern of climate change. We know the trajectory of what's happening here in our region. We're getting hotter and wetter. We're getting hotter and wetter. How will that impact the most vulnerable amongst us? What will that do for the health of people who already have the highest levels of hypertension, of stress, of diabetes, of asthma? Because these are the impacts on the environment that has a direct relationship to your ability to survive within it. Where are cooling stations that will allow people to cool down because they have so much heat? And all of that's a byproduct of policies of years past, where redlining produced communities who were only suitable for industrial and commercial development, because dollars were not made available for residential development. And what that did in turn was created more concrete, created more asphalt, created more industrial materials that we have to deal with today. And I think what we're looking at simply, in my way of thinking, is people dealing with or paying the bill for an expense that someone else charged. And that's the injustice. The justice is that the people who made the debt should have some some burden in the correction. And the people who did not cause the burden should not be inappropriately burdened with that responsibility to correct it alone.
So the work that I'm going to be doing to try to move this thing forward, I think really encompasses much of what Felicia has lifted up, much of what Nicky and Jerome have all lifted up, recognizing the impact this has on communities of color, poor, low-income communities, working poor and working class communities. We're talking about policies that are impacting folks. The question becomes, who makes those policies, right? So if we want, as the organizing director for the Working Families Party, what we are doing is two things. One, paying attention to the races that are coming up and making sure that we are electing folk who are clear about the need for a green economy and a Green New Deal, as well as making sure that our organizing in the communities that are most impacted is aligning with that. So if we are looking for policymakers to really champion our issues, we're not going to be waiting for folks to start caring about stuff, maybe 1.5 of our values. We're going to make sure that we're building relationships with folks in Southwest Philadelphia who are near that power plant, or for folks who are out in the wider Commonwealth who are experiencing the fracking that's coming from PGW, and making sure that those folks, as we believe the people who are closest to the pain or closest to the solution, are the ones that are being put into the legislature, being put into city council, being put into the governor's mansion. And so our focus is making sure that we are aligning with the issues as well. We're being informed by these communities about what needs to happen. I would love to hear more and speak to the Lenape folk to hear from them about what is about what is it that we need to be doing as it relates to electing folk and whatever it is that we need to do in order to make sure we get this thing right. But again, organizing around issues, making sure that our political parties are hyper focusing on the values that we've all lifted up today and electing the right people in office. So that will be our focus going forward.
So I have a lot of focuses, but the thing that combines them all is a focus on, I think a lot of people have already said it, community, and ensuring that our communities have the ability to live, survive, thrive, to make sure that when we save the planet, we're still here to see it. So within that work, I'm a member of Indigenous 215, which is a collective of Indigenous folks here in so-called Philadelphia. And we create space to share culture and issues with each other. And we also educate other people on Indigenous culture and Lenape history here in Lenape-Hoking. We also do Black and Native solidarity circles and medic trainings to make sure that those who are most impacted by capitalism, anti-Blackness, Indigenous erasure, settler colonialism, so to make sure that we have a space where we can talk about these things and be open about talking about the problem so that we can also create solutions that are going to center us, because we know that the system isn't going to center us. It has no intention of centering us. It has no intention of saving our lives. We are the only people with the intent of saving our lives. This country was founded on the annihilation of Indigenous people in order to take the land, and it was created by stolen hands of African folks. And so we know that this country was made to profit off of our backs. It is not going to turn around and try to save us. So we are done waiting. We have not been waiting, and we will not wait. So we are creating spaces where we can organize each other and organize with each other to develop mutual aid, to develop things that exist outside of the system, because the system is going to continue to murder us. Part of that is raising awareness about Indigenous communities and about who is being affected, especially in Pennsylvania. For example, I organize with someone who is Taino from Borican, which is so-called Puerto Rico. And I'm not sure if you all know about La Junta, which is the Puerto Rico Financial Oversight and Management Board. But Professor David Skeel Jr., who is a corporate lawyer here, is on that board. And that board is currently working to cut healthcare, pensions, workers' rights, and education in Puerto Rico in order to fund capitalism, in order to, again, create a genocide of the people of Puerto Rico so that they can take that land and take that space and use it for, like, white people going on vacation. And if we don't address those things, then we aren't addressing environmental justice. We aren't addressing environmental racism. If we don't address people like the lawyer and Penn professor Amy Wax, who is a social welfare lawyer here, and is also a white nationalist who believes that our country will be better off with more whites and fewer non-whites, direct quote, unfortunately. If we don't address that, then how are we going to address racism? If we have people who are teaching within our within the ranked seventh law school in the country, people are coming to this law school to learn how to defend environmental rights, environmental justice. Folks, they're coming to this law school to learn how to defend the law. And if we have people within this law school who are doing nothing but defending capitalist structures and white supremacy, then we need to have a system changed about that. So some of the work that I do with some of the people that I do the work with. I'm also a part of Philly for Real Justice and RAM Philly, which are both police abolition organizations, because we believe that when we break down capitalism, when we break down the prison industrial complex, when we break down the nonprofit sector, we're still going to need to know how to care for each other and care for ourselves. And so we build transformative justice spaces that don't rely on the state, in order to provide community resources so that when we get free, we can care for each other and provide mutual aid. I also do work at the UN, mainly shutting things down because the UN, even with because it's necessary, because the UN will have a climate change symposium. It's not the word I'm looking for, summit, that's what I'm looking for. They'll have a climate change summit, and they'll invite Shell Oil Company to come talk at it. So if you thought the UN was going to save us, it's not. It's not here to save Indigenous folks because nation states are inherently founded on, again, the eradication and genocide of Indigenous people. So we work there to build also Indigenous resistance on those levels, both on international levels, and to also be able to work with other Indigenous folks across the world who are working to sustain themselves and their communities in the face of genocide. And as was mentioned in my introduction, I also do frontline organizing with Indigenous people, generally around the so-called US, who are looking for direct action support and mutual aid.
So, hard act to follow. Working on the issues you've heard about a lot, making sure climate change mitigation policy benefits local communities as well as the world, and cumulative impacts. So I'm working on that on both state level, New Jersey, and a national level. I do about 50% of my work is national, about 50% is local. Working on trying to bridge the gap between the environmental and the EJ movements on a national level. Some of us are trying to work together. Another issue that we haven't talked about, my home, I'm a member of 3 or 4 EJ organizations. My home EJ organization is New Jersey EJ Alliance. And, that's how we're trying to do the state work. And for many EJ organizations, smaller EJ organizations led by people of color, although we're well integrated also, it's a struggle to survive. Less than 5% of the funding that goes to environmental issues go to EJ organizations. So on a very real level, a lot of the smaller EJ organizations struggle every day to make it. And part of the issue we're facing now is that we've done a good job, we being the EJ movement, in making EJ a sexy issue. But now everybody and their mother wants to do EJ. And we are in danger of being marginalized in our own movement because we don't have the name recognition, we don't have the number of people, working on the issues. For example, on the national level, we at one point we were talking to the environmental groups about, climate change policy. And when the EPA came out with their clean power plan, the rule is going to address climate change. We went to one organization and said, how many people do you have working on this? They said something like 30 to 50, whereas on the national level in the EJ movement, we had 3 or 4. So that's another issue, that we don't want other people coming in the EJ and, as all of us said, defining EJ for us in ways that we probably won't agree with.
And I do want to leave time for Q&A, but I do want to ask one quick question. I'm waiting just to get a few more cards over here from people that I know. We have so many things that we can continue to talk about. I can think of at least 10 questions just off the top of my head. And so one question I think that we might all be interested in that I'll just start with is, how would you like the audience members here with our varied amounts of privileges and disadvantages to further contribute to the environmental justice movement? I think we've already tapped onto this a little bit already, but feel free to build on it. How would you like the audience members, based on our different skills, talents, privileges, disadvantages, to contribute more to the environmental justice movement? If we could, I think Felicia was just about to start. If we'll just go down this way.
It seems really basic, but also has to be said every time. Learn about Indigenous folks. People are fighting right now across the country, across the world, across the continent to defend their rights and defend their territories. Just yesterday, people in so-called British Columbia were arrested as they were standing for the Wet'suwet'en rights and against the LNG pipeline. Across the world, people are being murdered and imprisoned for defending the environment. Indigenous folks are being put into prisons. Red Fawn Fallis from Standing Rock was put into prison for 5 years. So when we're talking about, especially in law, let's talk about like the criminalization of our body. Let's talk about the criminalization of us trying to live, of us trying to grow food, of us trying to get clean water. We are fighting for our right to live, and we are being criminalized for it. So if you have the ability, I hope you all have the interest. And I think that a lot of you also have the ability to provide, not only to educate others, which is a great first step, educate yourself, and then tell others, but to also, the professor who's a part of La Junta just got an award for his pro bono service. If you actually want to provide pro bono service to people, you can. There are tons of Indigenous land defenders and water defenders who are currently in need of help in the law. There are entire Indigenous communities who are still seeking their sovereignty. Learn about those. Find out how you can be of help. As you're educating yourself, also advocate for Indigenous sovereignty. And tell people like, this is you now know this is Lenape Hoking, this is Lenape land. Learn about those people and find out. Go talk to them. Build community with the Indigenous people who you are already in community with, and ask them what they need. I'm really excited to hear you wanting to talk to Lenape folks, and I'm like, yes, let's definitely get you in touch with them and make sure that the solutions that you have are centering Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. And are centering their education. I just talked to someone, Ishmael, who was on the education panel earlier, and we're working on having Lenape history and Native history written into the curriculum so that people in Pennsylvania and at least Philadelphia can't say they didn't know. So work to make sure that people can't say they don't know.
Yes, my hope is that folks are continuing to paying attention to the voices that are speaking most articulately about this, clearly about this, pointedly about this, like the Felicias of the world and the like, and making sure that when those persons are up for election that we are supporting them. My interest as with trying to create a party that is reflective of the multiracial working class, reflective of the working poor, and to try to be the party of the left in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is to make sure that we are elevating those voices and making sure that they're not being drowned out by corporatists who happen to buy themselves into elections. And so it's really important for those of us who have the power of the ballot to make sure that we're casting and such, and we're also using our finances, our resources to contribute to organizations that have been doing good work. If there are organizations that are producing groups and Dr. Nicky Sheats, like the New Jersey EJ Alliance, that we're making sure that we're placing our money into those organizations to continue to do the work that they're doing, that we're backing organizations that have long been fighting for this, Philly for Real Justice, things of that nature, that we're prioritizing them and not just listening, for a good hot take and then, kind of going about our life. So that would be my ask, I think, as we begin to build a new power block of folk that have been disproportionately disenfranchised and not seen in this movement. So, yeah.
So this is an interesting question, tough question for me. More years than I want to admit at this point, I was sitting where a lot of you are sitting. I mean, I went to a very elite law school. I went to Harvard Law School. And we used to have debates about, like within the communities of color. Now, what are you going to do when you go out in the world to, what are you going to do? And I remember specifically we used to have debates about, well, in the criminal justice system, would it be better for black folks if you were going to be a prosecutor or a public defender? If you go into corporate law, is that a betrayal of your people somehow? How are you going to help your community going into corporate law? And these were very tough questions. I took a road. You're talking about corporate. Harvard Law School is corporate. I'm probably one of the few people, and I never went into the private sector. And some of my classmates didn't either. But I did go the public defender route at one point. But I think what I would ask of you and what I would say is that you can make contributions wherever you go. And I remember when I first came to law school, I would think, oh, those people going to corporate law, they're going to, they're not helping folks. And I found out that some of them, many of them, most of them, I'm talking about black folk now, wanted to help people as much as anybody else. And, I think the white folk there did also. And so I think on a very personal level, you can make a difference wherever you go. And I think you have to look and try to decide how you're going to do that, no matter where you're from. I mean, I appreciate the young people on this panel. I'm including you too, Jerome. Because you all really do give me hope, and I really mean that. I mean, I love to hear you all talk, and I'm like, yeah, okay. But when I came into law school, I was very aware. I was on the first wave of affirmative action in the country. And I was very aware that I would not have been there if people had not died for me to be there. Literally died so I could go to elite schools. That was not an abstraction for me. And I felt the weight of that I had to go out somehow and help communities. But I want you to define that. And I want you to know that wherever you go, I know it's a tough question, you can help folks. And find your own path to doing that. And don't give up, and don't think, because I'm one person, and because wherever I am, I just can't do it. I can't affect the system. You really can. It may take a long time. It may be almost like you have to almost have faith, like you have faith in the afterlife, that things are going to get better. You can do it.
So what can you do? You can be a human being. We have an expression at the Overbrook Center, lead with human and follow it up with justice. Because one of the things that we always have to deal with is we need, in this work, you need competent people. You need people with competence. You need people with expertise. And you're dealing with communities sometimes that are vulnerable, people who are in pain, people who are in stress and under duress. And part of the issue is managing that. Because you have some folks who will come into a neighborhood and think that they own the neighborhood. We're doing you a favor. We're helping you. We're going to come into this poor neighborhood, and we equate poverty with some level of inhumanity. And, you know, if there's anything that I want to do is to take this opportunity, you use the term privilege, which I find an interesting term, that if someone thinks that they have privilege, then that means you have to give more than you take, from my way of thinking. So what you can do is to serve, go into communities and serve, ask people how you can help, seek to learn more than you seek to impose your ideas on what should be done. We tend to work with what we call the forgotten middle. People who are working hard and no one knows that they're working hard, no one knows that they're struggling with issues around the environment and how it's affecting their neighborhoods and their children. And people like that need help and support. But they don't need help and support in a way that makes them feel bad about themselves or bad about their circumstances. They need help as a human being would need help. And I implore upon you to seek that out, seek someone out, seek a community out. The interesting thing about Philadelphia is that you can ride all around. On your way to Wonderful, you can find all kinds of conditions where your support can be used and utilized. You don't have to look hard. And I'm really big about majoring in the minors, turning this whole construct of polar bears and penguins and North and South Pole into North and West Philadelphia, South Philadelphia, and the people that you walk by every day and never take a second look. The bottom line for some of this work is that we don't have to wait to get started. As soon as you become intentional about it, as soon as you wake up in the morning and decide, I'm going to get beyond my own self-interest, and I'm going to become a human being and help people so that we can work collectively together, we have a term we call the community of the willing. I implore upon you to become part of the community of the willing, of those people who can get beyond their own self-interest so that we all can fix the quality of our air, our water, and our land. We all need it. That's how you can help. There's neighborhoods that need people that could do pro bono legal work for them. There's neighborhoods, it's an interesting thing. I looked at the West Philadelphia plan, and 2% of it was industrial, yet there's a stretch of 5 blocks that has 60% of all the industrial activity in that one community. It's amazing how people have these clusters of activity that are affecting their water quality, air quality every day. And then when you look at, you layer on top of that the epidemiology of where people have these high incidents of respiratory duress is right in those areas. It's not rocket science, but people may need you to correlate that for them. You may be better at doing the research. You may be better at making the connection. And those are things that you may take for granted, but other people will find invaluable who are working on these issues. So my answer in short, get beyond your self-interest, become part of the community, the willing, help those who are more vulnerable and of need, but leave them with dignity. So start making that intentional decision that you're going to be just and equitable in that exchange. Because it's even worse when people come into a community and don't respect the people and the work that they've been doing prior to you getting there.
And I deeply apologize to everyone who wrote great questions for this Q&A. We have maxed out our time. Do please feel free to reach out to our panelists towards the end of the day, but can we please have a great round of applause for our panelists?